Hello viewers, welcome to the part 9 of the step-by-step Oracle Data Guard series, and in this concluding part of the series, we are going to learn about broadcast, cascade and parsing standbys. I would like to suggest watching the previous parts in this series first for better understanding on what we will discuss in this tutorial. Please also note that whatever commands that I am using in this tutorial, they are all available in my Google Drive and you can copy them using the link provided in the description of this video below. Now let's understand what are these different standby configurations called broadcast, cascade and parsing and their benefits. Broadcast. This is the simplest configuration of the standby that is implemented by default when the primary sends the redo data to one or multiple standby destinations based on the parameter log archive dest 1, 2, etc. settings in the primary. In this architecture, the redo data is parallelly sent to different destinations, so it increases the load on the primary database as well as the network traffic. This configuration minimizes the risk of data loss and ensures the fastest possible role transition. So far in this series, we have implemented the broadcast architecture only. Cascade. In this configuration, a standby database receives its redo data from another standby database instead of receiving it directly from the primary database. This is mostly implemented when the standbys are configured over a WAN. This configuration reduces the overhead associated with performing redo transport from a primary database and reduces the traffic in the network. However, this may increase the role transition time with a risk of data loss. We are not covering cascade standby in this series, but the steps and commands to manually create the cascaded configuration can be accessed from my Google document using the link in the description below. Parsing. This is the main topic of this tutorial. A DataGuard parsing instance is a remote Oracle DataGuard destination that accepts redo from the primary database and then ships that redo to other standby databases in the DataGuard configuration. It manages a control file, receives redo into standby redo logs or SRLs, and archives those SRLs to local archived destination and sends the redo to other standbys in the DataGuard configuration. But other than that, it is not similar to the physical standbys. The parsing is actually a hybrid configuration that takes the best of both broadcast and cascade configurations and makes them into one. It is a lightweight instance that consumes very little disk and processing resources, yet provides the ability to failover to a terminal destination with zero data loss. A parsing instance does not have user data files, cannot be opened for access by users, cannot run redo apply, and can never be converted to any type of other standby databases. Parsing instances are part of the Oracle Active Data Guard parsing feature, which requires an Oracle Active Data Guard license. Now, let's see why parsing is the best option when you want performance and protection both. Parsing supports two protection modes, maximum availability and maximum performance. It is kind of obvious for it not to support maximum protection, and parsing in fact gives us the zero data loss protection without compromising the performance. Now let's understand how it does that. Consider this setup where your primary database is in a data center in the US West region and the standby is in the Europe region, which is around 5,000 miles away. Now to maximize data protection, if you are transporting the redo with sync and FR mode, then think how severely the performance or the commit response in the primary will be impacted due to the network latency, as it has to wait for the confirmation signal that the redo data has been written to the disk from the standby, which is 5,000 miles away for each discrete chunk of redo. Now instead, if you configure a parsing somewhere close to the primary, say in the US Central region, which is a few hundred miles away from the primary, then you can still transport the redo with sync and FR mode with an acceptable network latency because the standby will receive the redo in the async and no FR mode from the parsing. In this configuration, even if the primary site is hit by a disaster, then also the standby will get all the redo it needs from the parsing. This is called parsing with maximum availability as protection mode. You can also have the parsing somewhere close to the standby, say in the UK region, which is a few thousand miles away from the primary, but a few hundred miles from the standby. And this configuration is called parsing with maximum performance as protection mode. Network latency in this configuration does not impact the commit response because redo transport mode is async here. You can have multiple standbys receiving redo data from the same parsing to have even better protection without compromising the performance, and can even have multiple parsings to provide high availability with one being the preferred active parsing. Now that we have learned about the parsing configuration at a high level, now let's create a parsing instance to see it in action. I will create the parsing instance using OEM since we are mainly focusing on OEM techniques in this series. The steps and commands to manually create the parsing instance can be accessed from my Google Drive using the link in the description of this video below. First, we will go to our DataGuard administration page in OEM to take a look at the current configuration. Let's increase the screen size. And here we see that the primary database is currently testdg1, which is hosted in the host named Linux1, and the standby database is named testdg2, hosted in the host name Linux2. And there is no gap between the primary and the standby because the last received log is 563 and the last applied log is also 563, and the estimated failover time we can see less than 1 second. So everything is alright. And to create the parsing instance, we are going to take another host named VM Linux1. Now please note that the host where we are going to create the parsing must have the same OS platform, same Oracle binaries installed and accessible from both the primary and the standby host. And that host must be discovered already in your OEM system. Please also note that we have another host where we have configured the DataGuard observer to achieve fast start failover capability. Now let's log in to our primary host named Linux1 as root user. Let's increase the font, and I will also log in to the standby host named Linux2 as root user. I will switch user to Oracle later on, and then I will also establish one SSH session to the third host named VM Linux1 where we are going to host or create the parsing instance. Connect as Oracle user, and all these 3 sessions we just established to the primary host. Now let's sudo to Oracle user in the primary host, and then we will do the same in the standby host also, and then we'll go back to our OEM screen. Now to create the parsing, we'll press this add parsing button in the standby databases section. So press the add parsing, and then in the next screen we have to specify a couple of things. First, the host, and by default it is selecting the primary host, which actually we are going to change to the third host that I just mentioned named VM Linux 1. So let's search for it. We should be able to see the already discovered hosts in the list of hosts here, and this is the one that we are going to use, that is vmlinux1.oraexpert.org. Select this, and this is the Oracle home it is taking by default. Let's validate whether this home is physically present in the parsing host. So we'll go to the parsing host session that we established using SSH, and we'll do an lslrt, and the path that we copied from the OEM screen, and we see it's returning something, means this path is valid. Also, we can take a look at the etc Aura tab file where we see that exactly the path that is shown in the OEM is available in the parsing host. Let's go back, and the instance name. This name is the name of the instance with which the parsing will be created. So let's give it a name as testdg fs, and unique name we'll put it the same, that is testdg fs, and the target name test dgfs, and then we will put the server name at the end. That is the convention we have been following. And the storage will be file system credentials, where we have to specify the named credentials which will be used by the job to create the parsing. So the primary database host credential, let's select the search button, and from there in the list we'll select the named credential that we created as NC Oracle Global. So this particular named credential is used across all my VMs to log into the servers using Oracle user. Press the OK button. Then also for the parsing instance host credential, we'll select the same named credential, select the named option, then select the named credential as NC Oracle Global, and then press the next button. It will validate whatever we have just selected. Everything seems to be correct, and it is selecting a database area and fast recovery area automatically. We are okay with that. If you want, you can change it. And please note that the fast recovery area size it is taking is 8 gigs, which is sufficient for this test purpose. But in your case, it may be different, because for a production system, there may be a lot of space required for the redo logs, which it is going to receive from the primary. Now, the listener configuration. Specify the name of the listener that will be used for the parsing instance. So if you are going to use a listener which is already present in the server, then you can specify that. I am going to create a new listener with the name testdgfs listener. And the port, let's select something as say 1555. And then select standby database, which it is automatically selecting as the only physical standby database that we have in our configuration. Then press the next button. Now in this screen, we are able to see whatever settings we have just applied, and then we will press the submit button. So it has submitted a job to create the parsing, and if we want to see the detailed status of the job, we can click on the view status button here, and it will take us to the screen where we'll be able to see the job status. And the real-time 30 seconds refresh is on, so it will give us a status update every 30 seconds. And we will wait until the status becomes success. I will pause the video and I will resume once the job is completed. And after 2 minutes and 11 seconds, the job got completed and we see the status as succeeded. Now let's go back to our administration page, and here we see the updates in the standby databases section, where a new database named testdgfs from the host VM Linux 1 and the role parsing has been created, and everything looks to be perfectly all right because we see these green check marks on the important sections. Now let's go to the DataGuard broker manager prompt in the primary host to check the configuration in detail. So I will go to the SSH session in the primary server, and I will set the environment, and then I will connect to the DataGuard broker manager prompt dgmzrl sys/testdg, which is the password, as sysdba, and then we'll do a show configuration verbose. And here we see that the configuration is giving us all the details, that is protection mode is max availability, members, testdg1 is the primary database, testdg2 is the physical standby, and members not receiving redo, testdgfs parsing instance. It means our parsing instance is not yet receiving any redo from the primary. Although we have created the parsing, it has not yet started taking the actions as per the expectation. So what we have to do, we have to set certain initialization parameters for this to take effect. Now let's establish another session to the primary database host, switch to Oracle user, set the environment, then I will log in as sysdba, and I will see the log archive dash parameters first. Let's scroll up And here we see that the log archive config parameter has been successfully updated, because we see there are three values: test dz1, that is the primary; test dz2, that is the standby; and test dzfs, that is the parsing. And log archive -1, which is taking the local archive location, and the log archive -2 is actually sending the logs to the test dz2 standby database instance. And we see no other settings there. It means we have to set one of these parameters so that it sends the redo logs to the parsing instance. Similarly, we will go to the standby host, set the environment, connect as sysdba, and we will do a show parameter log archive to see what are the settings here. And here also we see that the dgconfig parameter is correctly taking the three values, and the log archive dest is correct. And because the standby doesn't have to send the redo logs to anywhere, there is no other parameters set. So this is correct. Now let's go to the parsing host, that is VM Linux 1, and we will now see the etc oratep file one more time. And here we see there's a new entry here that is with the name of the parsing, that is test dzfs. Now let's set the environment for the parsing instance and do an SQL plus sysdba, and we'll do the same thing, show parameter log archive dest. And here we see that it is only having the local destination for archival and no other parameters are set. It means we have to fix this here also. Now to fix all these settings, we have to use the DataGuard broker manager prompt, because DataGuard broker is in control of our DataGuard configuration. We will not be able to make changes bypassing that. So we have to make the changes using DataGuard broker manager prompt only. So we'll go back to our session with the primary host, where we already have the DataGuard broker manager prompt. Now the first thing we have to do is to disable the fast start failover if it is already enabled. But we see that the fast start failover is already disabled, so we don't have to worry about that. So the next thing we have to do is to disable the parsing so that we can make necessary changes. So disable parsing test dzfs. I'm just copying and pasting the commands to avoid making any typing mistakes and to save time. So the parsing instance has been disabled. Next, we are going to use the command to set the redo routes property for the primary database. So edit database test dz1 set property redo routes, where it is going to tell that it needs to send the redo to the parsing instance, that is local colon test dzfs space sync within brackets and single quotes. So property redo routes updated. Next, we have to set the log transport mode for the standby. Using edit database test dz2 set property log xpt mode equals to async. You see, I have already explained where the standbys will now receive the redo in async mode, and the property has been updated. Next, we will set the property redo routes for the parsing instance, and it will be updated with the primary and the standby. Please note that it is anyway going to send the redo logs to the standby, but if there is a switchover happens, then only it will start sending the redo logs to the primary. So press enter, and the redo routes for the parsing instance has been updated. Now we will enable the parsing, which we have disabled in the beginning. So enable parsing test dzfs, and it has been enabled. Now we will also enable the fast start failover. It requires the observer to be already on, so I believe it is already on. And now we see that there's a nice message coming, enabled in zero data loss mode. So this is what we wanted. Now we will again do the show configuration verbose command to see everything in detail. And now we see a different picture here where we see the members as testdz1, the primary database, testdzfs, the parsing instance, and then the testdz2, which is the physical standby database. Now let's go back to our database session that we established to the primary database, and we will do the show parameter log archive again to see the changes. Let's scroll up, and now we can see the local archive destination. It is still intact, but the log archive dest2 parameter has been changed, and right now it is sending the redo logs to testdzfs, and it is not sending the redo logs to the standby database anymore directly. Now let's do the same thing in the parsing instance with a show parameter log archive, and here we see that the log archive dest2 parameter has been updated, and now it is sending the redo logs to the standby database named testdz2. Let's take a look at the same property of the standby database also, although it doesn't matter. Scroll up and we see it is unchanged, but we don't have to worry. Now let's go back to our OEM screen for the data guard administration. Let's refresh it, and we see everything is perfectly all right, and our parsing instance has been successfully created with the maximum availability as data protection mode with the zero data loss capability. You can play around the parsing if you have created it in a virtual environment, do switchover, failover, etc. Everything will work as before the parsing setup. Only point to be noted is if you do a switchover to the current standby, you have to execute the relevant steps in the data guard broker manager prompt as I did before to set the redo route and log xpt mode properties. I am giving those steps in the description for you if you want to do experiments on that to have more concrete concepts on how these things work. So our parsing configuration is at its best with all the required settings including zero data loss protection. I have also given the steps to remove the parsing, because even if there is a remove button here, if you try to remove the parsing using this button, it is going to throw an error. So if you really want to remove the parsing, just follow the steps that I have given in the description. With this, I am concluding this series on Oracle Data Guard, and I will come back with a new topic on databases shortly after this. So viewers, please provide your feedback in the comment section of the video and hit the like button if you found it useful. That will mean a lot to me and help grow this channel.